Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, and welcome to At Family Office TV, and for my members who get to interact and often hear it, a little exception partially for today. First, before I ever make it public, my members of SFO Continuity, welcome so much, and we encourage you, especially those as my members, to interact, and that's one of the advantages to interacting live at the moment by being invited through a special webinar function. Today, and I've been looking to cover this from an investing but also an other perspective for probably 6 months now. And I think I'm the first one in the family office world that is going to cover it in a dynamic way that I think we're going to do in it today. And that is exploring GLP-1s, health breakthroughs, and market opportunities. Now, yes, my audience is often very active allocators and investors. That is going to be the brunt of what we're going to cover today. So I hope you're going to enjoy it. But I do think there are other subjects that lead into it on the health breakthroughs, on the advantages for society, and some little challenges that I perceive that we're going to have a great discussion today with our special guest. And on that note, our special guest is Yuri Khodjamirian. He is the Chief Investment Officer of Tema ETFs. Yuri, how are you?
Very good. Thanks for having me on.
And I do want to make sure that I properly pronounce that. Yuri is joining us all the way from Europe. Did I say the name of the ETF properly, Yuri?
It's Tema ETFs.
Tema. Okay, my bad, as we say here in the States. And my audience knows that I may have one or two skills. I'm still searching, but pronunciations, due to my dyslexia and some of my other challenges, are sometimes a little bit of a stretch and a reach for me. Now, we get a great medication on that we could also make money on, then I'm really all in. But we could save that for a little bit of a different time. There is no question that GLP-1s have hit the stage incredibly powerfully. It's making an impact on people losing weight through obesity. It's helping with diabetes and heart issues. I can't deny, and really at the heart of it, it's a peptide. And people like me that have been active in the world of health and wellness intensely for, in my case, about 5 or 6 years, we're broadly familiar with peptides. So this is a little bit unique. But on that note, I think it's important because I don't want to make assumptions as to where people are. So why don't we start with a little bit of the health and science behind this? Can you explain some of the science behind GLP-1 drugs?
Absolutely. So you've probably all heard of drugs like Ozempic, Wegovy, Zepbound. But if we take it back to the science of it, effectively what these are copies of a hormone that's produced in the human body. And this hormone is called GLP-1. And this hormone, actually hormones are very unique chemicals in our body because they're sort of preserved even across different species. So dogs have them, cats have them, and they're a very fundamental molecule in how processes in the human body get controlled. GLP-1s are in a group of hormones called incretin hormones. So they basically control how blood sugar is, basically the level of insulin in our blood and how blood sugar is controlled as well. And GLP-1s were probably discovered kind of in the 80s and 70s in labs in Boston and Copenhagen. And for the first time, they started to see what these hormones and what their function was. And they realized that the function was quite powerful in terms of controlling blood sugar. And that's why GLP-1 started their life in diabetes, an obvious place to start. And they were first developed in this place. The key challenges to developing it as a drug was getting this longevity because they get broken down in your body quite quickly. So the idea was, can we chemically engineer it so that it survives for a long time? You're right, it's a peptide. So peptide is, let's call it a little bit more of a complicated molecule than an aspirin. An aspirin is, in biological terms, called a small molecule or simple chemical. Whereas if you look at some of the other drugs, they're often antibodies, which are very complicated biological molecules. Peptides sit somewhere in between. It's about 31, 32 amino acids, depending on the drug you're looking at. And these drugs are effectively, were first developed in diabetes. But when they were running these trials in diabetes, they discovered that they had an effect on weight loss. patients were starting to lose weight in a way that hasn't really been seen before. And some companies at the time, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, decided to test these drugs in weight loss. And that's how the original trials were done on obese patients. And this led to really what was a fundamental breakthrough. The studies showed we're talking about 10, 15, in some cases 20% weight loss. And previously, a pharmacological intervention wasn't able to reach these levels at all. The best we had managed to reach was kind of single-digit percentages. The gold standard really is things like bariatric surgery, where it's a very invasive procedure that can lead to maybe 20, 30% body weight loss. And so this was the revolution. And a couple of years ago, these drugs were launched on the market. And as we know today, they're seeing huge uptake in popularity, partly because of the weight loss, which of course we all know about from personal experience. But really what the companies have done over the last couple of years as well is shown significant clinical benefits in lots of different areas as well. There's suspicion in the medical community of whether weight loss directly leads to medical benefits. And these suspicions have now been laid to rest through clinical trials. So hopefully that kind of sets the scene in a basic terms. GLP-1s are the backbone of lots of these obesity treatments, but of course these companies are working on newer treatments as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Yuri. And of course, I think everyone's going to broadly be familiar with the verbiage Ozempic, Novo Nordisk. Who makes Wegovy, and who are some of the other core pharmaceutical players in the space?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ozempic is the brand name. So let's in drugs, usually you have the chemical name. In the case of Ozempic, it's semaglutide. Now, semaglutide, when it's formulated for diabetes, is under the brand name Ozempic. And what's interesting is that originally Ozempic was launched for diabetes, but they had started to do the trials and discover the weight loss effects. So people were using it off-label, and doctors were prescribing off-label for people to lose weight. And people were trying to get their hands on Ozempic as a way of losing weight. Then the company did studies and showed that at higher dose, the same active ingredient, semaglutide, could be used for obesity. And then it got approved for that by the FDA. And that approval was under the brand name Wegovy. So for all intents and purposes, they're exactly the same thing, but one is a higher dose than the other. And one is approved for obesity and the other is approved for diabetes. And just so everyone's aware as well, they're a weekly injection that you do with what's called an auto-injector pen. So very sort of simple needle. You don't really feel very much, but you do the injection once a week. These two drugs, so the ingredient here, semaglutide, is produced by Novo Nordisk from Denmark, which was the original company to discover the usage of GLP-1s in obesity and diabetes. The other major competitor in this space, and the only other drug approved for obesity, the GLP-1 drug, is Eli Lilly. And Eli Lilly has come out with a drug first for diabetes called Mounjaro. The chemical name is tirzepatide. And then this has now been approved as of December last year in obesity as well under the brand name Zepbound. Again, very similar concept, a little bit higher dose, different brand name.
And back to in terms of diabetes and obesity, to give the audience a little bit of numbers. If you want to be specific to the US, great. If you want to go around the world, we'll start with diabetes. It impacts what percentage of the population, we believe?
Oh, that's a great question. We're talking millions of patients that are suffering from type 2 diabetes. I can give you the obesity statistics. That's probably more helpful here.
That was going to be my next question. I'm sure, by the way, that there's not 9 billion people in the world. It's with diabetes, depending on type 1 or type 2, or even pre-diabetes. I wouldn't be shocked if it's above 100 million. Like, it's a lot. It's a very, very big number. But correct, obesity, there appears to be more statistics thrown around. And I'm going to have a comment after that in a second, but why don't I have you give the numbers behind it?
Absolutely. So there's a publication called the World Obesity Atlas. They estimate statistics, but there was recently a study done by Lancet, which found that right now in the world, there are about 1 billion individuals that suffer from obesity. Now, obesity is defined by having a BMI over 30. And so there is also a category where it's between 25 and 30, BMI, for those that don't know, is a body mass index. It's a measure of effectively your weight, but relative to your height. And between 25 and 30, you're considered overweight. So depending on how you classify it, now interestingly, these drugs are approved for BMIs over 27, so they're somewhere in between those two metrics. But effectively today, there are 1 billion individuals in the world that suffer from obesity, have a BMI over 30. And the projections are that over the next decade, this number is going to double if there's no intervention to about 1.9 billion people in the world. If you layer on top of that overweight, it actually gets a lot worse. And by 2035, the expectation from the World Obesity Atlas is that nearly 4 billion people will suffer from being overweight or obese. And that is, nearly 50% of the world's population. In the US, the figures are very similar. So we're talking 42% of the US adult population today is considered obese. And that these numbers have been getting worse for a long time. And the projections are somewhere that by 2035, there'll be 140 million individuals who are obese or overweight, which is a huge number.
Those are huge numbers. And the reality is it is worse in the US. I think it's pretty obvious for anyone who travels the world. Everything is oversized here. I have European friends that come here, whether they go to fast food, which they shouldn't, but once in a while, or restaurants, they're just surprised. Like, wow, your Italian restaurants, the dishes are much bigger than when I go to Italy. And of course, they don't taste as good, but that's a different subject. There are some people, and maybe it's more or less obese and more clinically overweight, that could state, I think the statistics could be in the US, as much as 74% of people. And the trends that you noted, both in the US and globally, are increasing. It's a very important point to note to the audience. It's not leveling, it's not getting better, it's increasing. So then the question, I think logical thinking is, okay, it's obese. It means I'm notably, quote unquote, as deemed to be by BMI and maybe other indices, overweight. What is the impact of that? The impact of that is, we mentioned one already, diabetes, which could have a very dire consequence of death and many complications leading into that. Yet it's very obvious, it doesn't take a genius here to figure out, it's really, really bad for your overall health, your all-cause mortality, and the reality is the massive amount of stress on your heart. So your cardiovascular system, we mentioned diabetes. I think there's going to be some studies that show it could be negatively impactful to cancer. It's a laundry list. It's a long list that being obese is, in my opinion, I believe in a completely free society. Eat what you want to eat, drink what you want to drink. But there are going to be consequences to you and possibly to society on healthcare cost from that. But nonetheless, I'm willing to give that. Do what you want to do. That's the American, the libertarian sort of way. But if you could talk a little bit, I brought in heart disease now, potentially cancer. There is no upside to being obese. It impacts your health. It impacts your family, your loved ones. And it does have at minimal, an indirect impact on society.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. All of the above is the answer to this. So the estimates are that there are something like 220 what are called comorbidities with obesity. So these are diseases associated with obesity. You mentioned a few of them. The biggest ones are obviously diabetes. They're kind of, I've hesitant to say, sort of bedfellows, right? Effectively, obesity is the number one cause of diabetes. And as you said, there are millions of people who are affected by diabetes as well. And it's a major risk factor of that, including prediabetes. But the real big one is cardiovascular disease. As we know, still to this day, the number one killer globally is cardiovascular disease. And obesity is a major risk factor for that. So basically, 80% of patients who have coronary heart disease will be obese. And it's a major part of why you probably don't want to carry that extra weight, or you want to maybe take these drugs to reduce your weight to reduce this risk of cardiovascular disease. And what we've seen, and I think this was the watershed moment for GLP-1s, it happened last year when Novo Nordisk read out what they call the SELECT study. And the SELECT study was 17,000 patients, 5 years. They followed these patients and they wanted to measure outcomes. So they gave a group of patients Wegovy and they gave a group of patients placebo, effectively, or standard of care for other treatments. And they wanted to see, will this reduce the risk of what they call major cardiovascular events? Here I'm talking about heart attack, stroke, or non-fatal heart attack or stroke. And what they found is that taking Wegovy in this randomized clinical trial reduced the risk of major cardiovascular events by 20%, which is substantial. So effectively, this was the first time that we've seen an outcome study, as these are called, of actually saving lives, including saving hospitalizations from some of these other non-fatal types of disease. But the list is very, very broad. So we're talking about fatty liver disease, chronic kidney disease, sleep apnea. As you mentioned, there's also obesity-associated cancers. And very recently, there are some also studies showing obesity associated with neurodegeneration and other things. As we know, there's a big link between the gut and the brain. And it's very important, if you can control some of those things, that has an effect. And so what's happening now is these companies have shown clinical trials in the areas that I've just mentioned. So improving diabetes, we know that. Cardiovascular risk, we know that. There's been studies in fatty liver now that show a reduction in fatty liver, chronic kidney disease as well, and sleep apnea, interestingly. And the future set of studies is going to be looking at things like neurodegenerations, for example, Alzheimer's. Could GLP-1s work in Alzheimer's as well, or some of these obesity-associated cancers? This is where it gets very interesting as well. But effectively, as this has been proven out, I think healthcare systems around the world are waking up to the fact that this drug works, and it works to help improve health outcomes. And therefore, it's not just about the weight loss, it's about health outcomes, and hence they should be prescribed.
Yuri, there is no question that these drugs will have a positive impact on people, families, and society for the reasons noted. Beyond even the obvious of heart disease and diabetes, all the other ones you noted. And again, we don't have time to go into all of them. That obesity causes grave challenges, and this is going to be good. It's an opportunity that now that it's been out, there's people that have had a dramatic impact, on their look, if you want to call it that. I'm not saying whether that should be important or not, but the underlying areas pertaining to diabetes, sleep apnea, heart disease, etc. That is all great. Where I'm going to maybe push back a little bit is I believe there have been governmental authorities or independent agencies that have labeled obesity as a disease. So why don't we start there? Am I correct about that, or am I making this one up?
Yeah, I think it was around, I can't remember from memory, but maybe sort of 5, 6, 7 years ago, maybe even a bit longer, that the Center for Disease Control in the US officially labeled obesity a disease. Now, this is it's a long-running debate in the health community. I think that there's definitely physicians that see it as a choice, or see it as some sort of maybe related to psychology or whatever it might be. I think with the advent of the GLP-1 drugs, I think the moment you have a drug for something and it reduces that thing, people maybe start to come around to the fact that it could be a disease as well. But I'm aware that there's some discussion on whether this is the case. There's some interesting, papers around this, because effectively the idea that it's a choice that you should just eat less and therefore it's going to reduce your obesity. Perhaps the fact that you need your GLP-1 levels controlled to be able to actually shed the pounds is possibly one of the best proof points that it is and should be classified as a disease.
Very interesting points, and a little bit of my pushback and commentary. It's hard for me just to ask questions and be totally quiet, although probably often I should. I push back on that one to a degree. I often wonder what's the underlying reason for labeling it as a disease. Does it help push it through insurance? Is there a monetary reason for labeling it as a disease as a benefit? I hate to be negative, but I just simply know how the world works. And absolutely, do some people have hormonal challenges where getting blood tests, getting workups, and then whether it's thyroid or whether it's other areas pertaining to hormones that would need to be adapted or treated, of course. But obviously, and I think this has been proven, and I had a weight issue for a modest one, but for a number of years, and I'm extremely active in my health and wellness now, and I probably push certain boundaries. It's my choice. But yes, I believe it may, from my perspective, be a bit of a stretch to call it a disease, eating less and moving more. And I know I simplified eating and exercise, but truly, it's often a macro and a little bit of a micro, a calorie game. Now, some of us may burn more calories than others. That could be a hormonal thing that, again, I agree, needs to be looked at. And maybe there is something in some of us that doesn't cause a sense of fullness from food. And it's just very, very hard, even if it is partially psychologically. And therefore, perhaps a GLP-1 type medication could be of value there. I'm not denying it. I'm basically, for the most part, kind of agreeing that the drugs are going to provide tremendous value. I just don't want people to forget that eating really good and not huge amounts of food and movement and exercise is really, really valuable. Actually, I believe the Danish government, again, where the primary pharmaceutical maker of Ozempic, period, is based, recommends actually diet and exercise as, quote unquote, the first option. Now, many of you also saw the 60 Minutes interview, a little bit of irony that I believe them or drug companies are not allowed to advertise within, quote unquote, the country. Yet, so America, which has a large population, which apparently has more freedoms in terms of advertising and has a larger population of people with diabetes and obesity, it's fertile ground. Now, I'm a capitalist. I want to make money. And by the way, I think these opportunities in the pharmaceuticals and in what you're doing with the ETF are going to be absolutely successful. But I just like to dig a little deeper intellectually, a little bit behind the scenes, and how the world works and how money moves and how governments make decisions and qualifying this disease or not disease. You could say, by the way, Angelo, you're not a doctor, you're not a researcher, you're not a member of the CDC. Your commentary is just personal. 100%. I agree with you. Nonetheless, if you wanted to comment before we move on, I'll give that final word on that subject to you.
Look, I'm not a doctor either, and I haven't suffered from this, and I know it has detrimental effects as well, and I know it's difficult for some people who have tried the various options of what you say, calorific deficit and exercise. I think the couple of comments that I would make is one, I think still to this day, it's still very much recommended, even if you're taking Ozempic or Wegovy to do exercise. I think exercise has its own benefits outside of just a weight loss. The other thing, and I'm sure we'll touch on this topic, is you want to keep the pounds off. And sometimes people, that is a great way, even if you're on Ozempic, to continue to do that, and to maintain to maintain your weight at the lower level. I think there's an element that some people might argue is the psychological part, and something very interesting, and it touches upon the neurodegenerative. We have GLP-1 receptors in our brain. And so there's something that links the gut to the brain and this hormonal chain. As I said, it's one of the most important molecules types, right, in the human body in terms of signaling. And it preserved across different species as well, which is very interesting. And what I'm trying to say here is that there's some anecdotal evidence that people on GLP-1 are also seeing a drop in other types of addiction as well. There are some trials ongoing, for example, in alcohol disorder, addiction, and these areas. And why I think that's interesting is that the GLP-1 receptors in your brain? Is there something to do with that? Does that have to do with obesity? And I think what we know for sure about the metabolic system and it's very complicated. It's unclear what effects this drug necessarily has. So I think those are the 2 points I would make. Diet and exercise, I support that. I think that should be part of it, especially if you want to keep the pounds off as part of this treatment. The second thing is that there's definitely something psychological here, because even if the GLP-1 effect has this psychological side to it and the effect on the brain. And the third thing is, of course, the commercial side is the reality, right? These companies want to make money off of this innovation that they've produced. They want to help patients as well. If we look at the different healthcare systems, yes, they needed it to be marked as a disease. Yes, they needed it to prove health benefits, because, for example, in Medicare, there's a long-held policy that we don't pay for weight loss. Weight loss is never compensated. Bariatric surgery, etc., are never ever paid for by its agencies unless you can show these health benefits, which is what happens. So I think you're right. In a way, there is still this debate, and there's still maybe some skepticism about what these drugs can do, especially over the long run.
Any drug is going to have some level of side effects. Probably a common one in so many drugs is nausea. But maybe a more significant one that we could touch on is muscle loss. Why that could be important, besides the fact of how people think about themselves and their ability to perform, and depending on their position, maybe a blue-collar job that's very physical. In construction, I could make the argument that things like that may matter. But on a little bit more, I wouldn't say a more serious note, but a challenge with growing older, especially after age 70. I'm forgetting, it starts with an S, the medical name for it, but basically is a significant loss which builds up year after year after year, but is probably more notable after 65 or 70 of muscle loss. So if someone now has the challenge of being overweight, aka obese, they go on the drugs, which I get it. There's probably way more problems with being obese than the side effects of the medication. But now there is a challenge of potentially loss of muscle. How could that be counteracted? And again, I know we're not doctors here. Is it eating more grams of protein per day? Is it working out by lifting weights? Is there any feedback with your ears to the ground that you're getting to help offset what could be the impact? Or simply, is it maybe lowering the dose of the medication? What are some of the ways to counteract the potential of muscle loss?
So the area of the side effects of these drugs, and especially muscle loss, is super interesting, I think. I think we should maybe touch about the tolerability and the side effects profile in general, the nausea, but there's also other serious side effects like vomiting and some gastrointestinal things. The discontinuation rate actually of this generation, the GLP-1s, is quite high. So, Novo Nordisk says that effectively by 12 months, only 30% of patients are still on the medication. If you compare that to diabetes or other types of chronic medication, 50% of patients are still on it after 12 months. So there's always a drop-off rate with chronic diseases, but this is quite stark. Part of that is the tolerability. Some people they shed the pounds and then they just can't tolerate the nausea and vomiting, maybe some gastrointestinal side effects. So that's absolutely a problem. And that's, I think, why you can't just maybe invest in and look at the winners today. You have to look at the companies that are developing newer treatments that are going to be better in terms of this tolerability. One other area is muscle loss. Now, this is the point where when I talked about 15 to 20% weight loss, I specifically use the word weight. So you lose that weight, but it's across the body, right? And so the key question is it being lost in fat, or is it being lost in muscle or bone or other parts of the body? And actually, interestingly, the studies have shown that you're losing the weight, but you are losing muscle. You are losing more fat than muscle. So your body composition actually improves on these GLP-1 drugs. So that's the first point to point out, that actually your body composition is better. Now, for some patients, as you say, construction, but specifically older patients, who, by the way, have the same obesity rate as adults in the US, this is bad because you're already losing muscle, so you're starting to do that. And there are now a whole set of companies looking at complementary drugs you take with GLP-1 that will be muscle sparing, or in some cases, which for the bodybuilder's dream, muscle gaining. So imagine a drug where that loses fat, gains muscle. I mean, it's like every personal trainer's dream. And effectively, some companies are working on this. It's very early stage still. We don't know if it's going to work, but I think it's an important area of investigation. Now, what the doctors that we speak to, the key opinion leaders, they tell us that we're not so sure this matters so much apart from the older population. If your body composition is improved, and when they look at patients, they say the function of someone who's taken this has lost the weight, but reduced fat more than muscle, but lost muscle as well, is the same, if not better. Why should this matter medically to us? We don't necessarily have that answer yet, and we definitely don't have an answer for the older population, and that's why companies are going for it as well. But I think, the slightly cynical hat that you have on as well is maybe they're thinking about the aesthetic industry as well, in a way.
Well, yes, that certainly does. That does matter. There's a very big market for that. Trust me.
Absolutely.
You actually hinted at it, but the production of GLP-1 drugs is complex. So for a new pharmaceutical company or even an existing one to compete with the two plus that are kind of out there now, it's not always easy. And even the current companies, the complexity of the drugs to create, if you could talk a little bit about their processes, their ability to expand, and other competition, which in what you do, investing in more of a basket of opportunities that are impactful via GLP-1s, that may be a positive. And for you to be tactical, knowing weightings and things like that, which we may get into a little later in our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the background of this is that you need to take a fund approach, but you also need an active manager, an expert, which we have, kind of looking at all of these dynamics and how they're changing, because the winners are well known, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly. And the question is, what is the next generation going to look like, the third and fourth player? How are any players going to leapfrog these companies? And is it dynamically changing? There's data coming out all the time. But if we specifically focus on the manufacturing problem, the issue is it's a peptide, right? And peptides are effectively almost like a quasi-biologic. And biologics, as we know, are quite difficult to manufacture. There's a lot of very complicated processes in terms of bioreactors, all those kinds of things. And particularly, you also need to then, in a sterile way, fill that drug into the auto-injector pens, which you need to produce as well. So this is very, very different from producing aspirin. And it's part of the reason why it's taking supply is very limited. Anyone who was listening who's tried to get their hands on the drug, it's actually quite difficult. And they've been in shortage on the FDA list for a long time now. And this is because it's very tough to manufacture at scale. And the reason why these companies aren't making already very, very big because of this. And I think maybe the most telling example is Eli Lilly, who's built the plant, and it took them 5 years to build it. Because remember, all of this process needs to be certified by the FDA as well. And you can imagine the certification that goes into this as well. They are spending billions of dollars. And Novo Nordisk has gone as far as buying one of their suppliers to make sure they have enough supply of certain capacity for certain parts of that manufacturing chain. And this is telling, right? They're spending billions of dollars. So it's creating a barrier of entry for especially these injectable drugs and GLP-1s, producing peptides. Now, the key question and why the industry might change is, could someone create a small molecule like an aspirin that also targets GLP-1 that works, maybe not as well as the injection, but works
orally? Yeah,
exactly. And so we that could unlock the whole market and could be the reason why it could be very, very big. But for now, demand far outstrips supply, and that's why we're growing fast, but we're growing not as explosively as we would otherwise.
Those are very good points. The fact that, although people with diabetes understand and deal with this, the fact that it's injectable, although a very, very, very narrow needle, nonetheless, psychologically for some people, and maybe more than just some, possibly 20, 30, 40%, just may be a little bit too much for them to bear. Therefore, the opportunity with advancements with new companies and others, that even if it's not quite as effective per dose, because peptides are very sensitive to stomach acids, advancements are getting better. And in the coming, months and years, there's no question there's going to be other companies in the space, complementary medicines that you noted. And obviously, you're at the forefront, keeping an eye on this and the opportunity from an investing perspective. Could I make a little bit of an argument that is there some level of concern among doctors or in the community that GLP-1 drugs may start to be overprescribed?
That's a very interesting question. I think doctors and certainly the key opinion leaders that we've talked to are very impressed with the data that's come out so far. What they're finding is more and more patient comorbidities are being included. So right now, it's quite restricted. So just because you have a BMI over 27 is actually not going to be a good enough reason for either your insurance company to pay for it or for a doctor to prescribe it. You need to have some sort of comorbidity. And once you get into comorbidities, you need to have data to show that it works in that particular area. So I think that we're still in the early stage of the adoption curve at we prove out the clinical benefits, and as these drugs are being used by patients. I think and as the data comes in, variously there's jokes in the industry that we should be putting it in the tap water, right? Almost, as they used to joke. But it's every time it surprises everyone how much effect it has. I think we're getting maybe close to the end of that. I think people are realizing this is really a big innovation in terms of treating a lot of these comorbidities and obesity. Because I think the one thing I'll say, Angela, is remember obesity, because it's associated with so many other diseases, it's almost kind of like the root cause of many chronic diseases. So we can start to treat the root cause. A lot of doctors get quite excited by that, right? Because you're saving all kinds of treatments and interventions down the line that may never happen because patients are taking GLP-1. So there's a question of like, maybe we're overprescribing. Really, if you prevent a lot of this other stuff, that could be just a genuine benefit. Now, no company has yet done a study which are called primary prevention. They've been done in statins before, but it's the idea of giving it to someone before they show any symptoms of any of these comorbidities. Maybe this will come at some point, at which point there will be a big expansion in the market.
Novo Nordisk has become one of Europe's largest, actually, if not the largest company due to Ozempic, which means there's always going to be competition. And your job as an investor is to be aware of what's going on with Novo Nordisk, of course, Eli Lilly and others. But the others, and we again hinted at this a little earlier, there's going to be competition. There's going to be complementary drugs that may fit in terms of what you're doing. How do you keep an eye on what companies, public companies in this case, are up and coming, and being tactical from how you're allocating from an investing perspective?
Absolutely. I think it's important to mention the fund that we're talking about here that invests in the obesity and cardiometabolic space. We invest more broadly in cardiometabolics in general. And we're looking at a lot of what we call these adjacencies to obesity as well, areas that are going to open up as essentially this develops. And this is going to develop both from a commercial and a medical perspective. If you think about commercial, a company like Eli Lilly that's building out a massive sales force in primary care. And this is a shift in how pharmaceutical companies have viewed the world. The last 20 years, I think, have been very focused on specialist care, oncology, hospitals, that kind of thing, and developing drugs in that area. And primary care has become genericized in many ways because we have pretty good drugs for things like hypertension and things like statins as well for high cholesterol. But there's now a new wave of development going on in some of these adjacencies. And we think that that's really interesting as well to bolt on top of that. So there's going to be some excitements in cholesterol lowering. There's going to be some excitements in blood pressure control. There's other types of heart disease, and they form a part of the fund as well. And I think a very important part. The second part is kind of the trying to understand who are going to be the winners in the obesity space. And here there's so many different companies, and it's very interesting to see. I mean, to name a few companies, you've got Amgen as an example of a company that's trying to take an antibody approach. And the idea is, can you have a longer half-life than a peptide in the body, and therefore do dosing that's maybe every once a month or every 2 months? That could be an exciting approach if they can show that. You have companies working on different incretin hormones. A prime example of that's amylin, which is another incretin hormone, and is a lot more tolerable in theory than GLP-1. And so the idea could be that, you take GLP-1 for the initial weight loss, and maybe you're on amylin afterwards as a way of maintaining that weight loss. As we mentioned, there's companies working on muscle sparing. There's many new upstarts that have pretty decent data sets. Here I'm talking about Structure Therapeutics, Viking, and others that are looking at being sort of fast followers or creating this. And of course, lots of other large pharmaceutical companies, here notably Roche and AstraZeneca, have decided to enter this space because they see a very large potential market, a way of entry into primary care where they could start to develop other drugs while they're selling it to these doctors. And that commercial channel, once they open that up, they might as well add new innovation. And that's why we're betting on as a second wave of obesity associated illnesses. So I think it's a combination of these things, right? It's kind of the companies that have won, that you know about, that are gaining lots of sales from the launch of these drugs and as the supply opens up, the next generation, who's going to be number 3, number 4 player, and who are going to be some of the smaller ones that maybe large pharma is going to acquire to get into this race. But then what we think is once you have these larger players going out there, talking to doctors, selling them obesity drugs, they're going to need more treatments, and who are the crop of biotechs working on interesting areas. And that what forms the whole sort of basis of this fund in various ways.
Valuations of GLP-1s produced companies have skyrocketed. So being an investor in some of the companies that we mentioned would have been good. Like anything, including technology and all that, I think it's too early, but are we potentially seeing a bubble? And like, what metrics do you look at? And part of it may be a level of diversity in some of the companies you're investing in. One day there's going to be a bubble, but I can make the argument that's a good day because that means it was a buildup like that for probably a long time for a bubble to occur.
So the answer here, and it goes to the core of what we try to do at Tema, and I think is really, really important. We're trying to bring a different approach to this type of investing. And typically what you would have seen before from ETFs and funds is they would have done this in a passive way. It would have been constructed as an index. It would probably very, very overweight these winners that are maybe at higher valuations. And you would have just ridden the bubble and then it would have crashed on you because the portfolio wouldn't have changed. Our approach is very different. We are actively managed. We have an expert, Dr. David Song. He's got 25 years investing in industry experience, looking at the space and other biological spaces as well. We have a team. We actually have the person who discovered GLP-1 in the lab in Copenhagen, the Professor Jens Juul Holst, as an advisor on our advisory board. And so the focus here is, can we try to avoid some of these valuation traps out there in the market through experience? Can we look at some of the maybe undervalued opportunities out there that we can transition to, and some of these adjacent areas as well to cushion if there's overvaluation in the obesity space? So what you're getting is kind of the whole package rather than necessarily just exposure to the overvalued parts of obesity. And we're trying to navigate this dynamic landscape as best we can.
Okay, and I would say as we begin to take it to my final third of our conversation, we're going to go pretty hardcore, maybe rapid fire on the investing aspect, building upon some of the things you already said. As someone overseeing GLP-1 ETF, what factors do you consider essential in building a robust portfolio in this space? Before you comment, I did a podcast last week where I spoke about my and other portfolios being a little bit of a believer, which by the way is contrarian. Many people disagree and that's fine, but a little bit of Charlie Munger of I want to have relatively a small basket and I want to watch it really, really closely. I want to be careful not being a beta hugger, not looking for, I want to have 300 holdings at whatever, 1/3 of 1% in each one. Like, I don't see as much value in that, but nonetheless, it's a question for you, not for me.
Absolutely. So our approach is generally to be closer to the Munger approach. So concentrated, we take conviction bets in the companies that we look at. But in biotechnology, which is a part of this as well, I think I would group this in the broader healthcare space because of its, primary care, its bigger markets and all those things. And there's also a medical device element to this, which we haven't discussed as well. But I think more broadly, what you're trying to do here is because you have biotech risk, you want to be diversified. So probably more diversified than just a couple of eggs, because there's a risk that some of these companies won't succeed. And the failure rates, as you know, in drug development are really high. So we're talking about 10% of drugs from phase 1 make it all the way to the market. So that means 9 out of 10 fail. And so you have to be very careful and selective in what you're trying to do. And you want to spread your bets a little bit as well. So we're talking about like 40, 50 stocks, that kind of range of companies in the fund. The most important metrics, it's a really great question. I think the one metric I would summarize all of this is trying to look for positive or asymmetric risk reward opportunities. Mm-hmm. What you see with drug development and drug development companies and even the medical technology space is you have to be cognizant of what's already kind of priced into the market. So what we're trying to do is not necessarily call the results of a trial or understand the impact of this particular drug necessarily to get it right. What we're looking for is mispriced opportunities where essentially if we're right, we make a lot of money. If we're wrong, we don't lose as much, and make sure we size those positions the right way. And we call these asymmetric risk reward opportunities. And I think that is actually one of the best ways to invest in this space and the most important criteria to look out for.
What role do companies like yours and the ETF play in democratizing access to GLP-1 opportunities? In other words, making the space more accessible, which you are, and what you're doing to the everyday investor and even family offices.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for a family office, you get effectively a person who's got 25 years experience looking at the space, looking after your investments in this targeted therapeutic area, the first ETF of its kind. You get it in an ETF wrapper, which is, as we all know, is more tax efficient, transparent, easier to use in your portfolios. And that is what Tema is about. It's bringing those unique individuals and unique investment strategies and approaches from the institutional world. I mean, Dr. Song worked for Rockefeller Capital Management, Balyasny, Millennium. You'll have heard of these hedge funds and mini shops. And we're bringing that to the ETF market, which I think is very unique. And we're doing that in a targeted approach, focusing on therapeutic areas that we believe hold the most potential for the future. That's basically the sort of 1 second pitch of what we're trying to achieve here to give investors a good outcome in the future.
Is the GLP-1 market overcrowded with major pharmaceutical players, or is there room for what I would call innovation by smaller biotech companies that could make a meaningful impact? If so, and they would need to be public in your example, how do you source them and how do you decide to allocate and manage that allocation?
Yeah, so David and his team, they look variously at all the companies that are listed in the market within the biotech space and within the pharmaceutical space. They also look carefully at private companies because they often come to the market as well. And so looking at IPOs, and they're trying to build what's called a proprietary universe of both obesity and cardiometabolic, more broadly, names that are exciting and interesting. And so we just try to stay on top of it and keep abreast of all of these opportunities out there. And yes, absolutely. As we all know, biotech's about disruption as well. And so a new upstart player could easily disrupt the new players if they can produce better clinical data. And this hits on the point you said earlier. What are some of the key criteria? Positive asymmetric reward, but also looking for companies that are genuinely trying to do something innovative. We really don't like Me Too companies or companies that are trying to copy others just to gain a commercial prize. We're investing in innovation. I think that's the right thing to do for our investors, but also for patients as well, to back those companies as well instead.
Considering the 5 to 7 year outlook for liquidity in GLP-1 markets, what strategies can investors take to manage the inherent risk of such long-term commitment?
Well, you're in an ETF, so you have instant liquidity in this case. The underlying companies that we invest in are quite liquid. As you know, we invest, even the smaller biotechnology businesses in America trade, remarkably a lot. And they often have average daily volumes in the millions and millions of dollars, even for small companies. So we always look very carefully at the liquidity of the underlying, which is what you should look at in an ETF. And if you go on our website, you can see the implied liquidity of the whole fund expressed as units of the ETF. So how much you could deploy without really any problem into the fund, even if you look at the fund and the liquidity of the actual fund is maybe a bit lower than that. And that's the most important way we manage liquidity within the portfolios. But there are lots of companies, it's very liquid. It's not really a problem. And we don't do any private investing, so there's no liquidity issues at all.
Are there factors that are unique to the GLP-1 market that make it particularly volatile or risky for investors? How basically I would answer that, and I'm sure you would agree, but I would like to hear a little bit of your commentary. You're probably not going to put 90% of your capital into something that arguably could be a little narrow and niche. I don't know whether it's 1%, 10% or more. That's up for individual investors to make their own decision. But how do you look at it from a smart investor And you hinted earlier, 40 plus positions, watch the basket closely, being tactical in some with a greater percentage more than others. But what else would you recommend as an investor yourself?
So if you're looking to, I guess, where does this fund and this approach fit in your portfolio? I think we see clients use this variously in different ways of expressing their view. For some clients, it's actually replaced healthcare holdings. So what would be a very broad holding, and because they sort of believe in the cardiometabolic and obesity story, they think it's going to be important because you're getting at the root cause of chronic disease. There's an exposure to medical devices, so they're covered off there. And what they're missing from the rest of the healthcare sector is not as important as focusing on this area. So we've seen clients look at healthcare as an important allocation in their portfolio and then replace that allocation or fill that allocation with an investment in this fund. So here we're talking about investing, up to 10%. If you look at healthcare as a percentage of the S&P 500, it's about 12% from memory. So if you're trying to say, I want a better allocation of healthcare, but I want the broad, at the same weight in your equity portfolio, you should be thinking something like a 10%. Then there are investors who like the thematic nature, but they want to combine it with a couple of other thematic funds and areas they really believe in for long-term growth. They then use these as a satellite allocation. Making that point on growth, I think is very interesting. Most investors out there will be sitting with a core allocation to the S&P 500, but what they maybe haven't realized is concentrations of the S&P 500 in large technology companies have got very extreme. And these concentrations are hitting records. Something like 37% of the S&P 500 is just 10 companies. So you think you're buying 500 companies, but the equivalent is actually buying 10 companies. And so you're making individual equity bets there already. And so, but when we talk to investors saying, well, you're exposed to S&P 500, what, and they're saying, well, if I look at these big technology companies, they're growing, and there's just, I don't know where else there is growth in the market. One of the areas is this space. And so we're seeing investors shift their growth allocation towards one of these areas, and maybe some of our other funds as well, as a way of getting exposure, maintaining the growth, but diversifying away. Because remember, healthcare and biotech, they operate on a different cycle in a way. They're a little bit immune to the economy. They have their own idiosyncratic drivers of return, and they're a little bit uncorrelated with the rest of the market, which is helpful for diversification purposes. That's roughly where we see clients use it in their portfolio. So first, as a replacement for their healthcare holding; two, as a satellite thematic holding, so smaller percentage; or three, as a way of bolstering their growth allocation by diversifying away from big tech growth.
I mean, someone actually did bring up a good point. Thank you for bringing it up in terms of viewer, listener. And that is basically, what is the impact broadly on obesity, including obviously diabetes, sleep apnea, heart disease, on the impact on the economy, on companies, on families, the amount of missed work, the ability or now needing to just not be able to physically perform in work and needing to retire early, not having enough resources and capital. It is absolutely impactful from a societal and an economic perspective in a very, very negative way. Henceforth, could something like this, enhancing people's health, and I could argue mobility, especially as they get older, be impactful from a societal and economic perspective as well. I know we covered some of this a little more earlier in the conversation, but if you wanted to comment, Yuri, it's all yours.
Well, absolutely. I mean, variously, I've read analyses from Goldman Sachs and others that suggest that the impact on global GDP could be bigger than AI, for example.
Wow.
So obviously there's a bit of an AI craze going on in terms of the productivity that's going to bring, but this is a genuine innovation. Now, if the truth is probably somewhere in between that kind of extreme view and maybe that there's no impact, but estimates range, I don't know, between 0.5 to 1% of GDP that this could add to world incomes. And it's all of the things that you talked about, but really the increased productivity from better health is probably the main driver of this. Maybe people remember, but last year when the Select study came out, there was a little bit of a GLP-1 craze, because if you look at consumption patterns of people who are taking GLP-1s, they're very different to what you would see, less snacks, less sort of salty food. And people are starting to understand, what is the impact on various industries like alcohol industry, gambling, all of these things, if there's an effect on addiction. It went as far as people were trying to say, well, this could save the fuel bill of airlines because, the weight of the passengers is going to be less than they're flying. There's implications. I think that period of craze is over, but we're now entering into that part of the hype cycle curve where the reality starts to kick in, and maybe we're going to start seeing the positive effects on growth over time. So I'm a believer that this will happen. It will just take a lot of time, and it's going to be very difficult to measure the effect.
And relative in the GLP-1 space, you mentioned, and I'm assuming making into part of the 40 plus in the portfolio, is medical devices. Give us a little more context.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's very sort of 25% of the portfolio is medical devices. Historically, they've been very important in especially the cardiometabolic system as a way of intervention. And so we like a lot of these kinds of companies. They provide a nice a nice kind of offset to maybe the therapeutic exposure, which can be a little bit more risky. These companies tend to have solid organic growth, long-term kind of markets to grow into, diversified revenue basis. And they're complementary in many ways to GLP-1, even though the market at the beginning when we launched one didn't think so. So if you take, for example, continuous glucose monitoring, people might say, well, you need less of that if we're going to cure everyone with diabetes. But the reality is that GLP-1 patients need that more because they still need to monitor their glucose. And it's still a growth industry. And we've been able to pick up some of these companies at very attractive valuations. And so that's kind of the complementing side. But here we're talking about valve replacement, stroke treatments, all kinds of other types of medical devices that go into this part of the portfolio.
And before I maybe get to my final question, then we'll wrap up, I will note to the audience that is listening or those that will watch it or hear it in a recording, do your own due diligence. When you invest, you can lose money. Everyone has different risk tolerance, liquidity needs, time horizon, and effectively a different focus on what their goals are. We are sharing our opinion for entertainment and somewhat engaging purposes at the moment. You may watch this a month or a year from now and everything changed. Opinions changed. We don't know. You're hearing this at the moment, again, for entertainment purposes. Do your own diligence. Think for yourself, because at the end of the day, sad but true, when you invest, you can lose money. On that wonderful cheery note, Yuri, if you don't mind, and the answer could be, Angelo, we're going to keep that close to the vest, but given that you're open as an ETF, it's pretty viewable, maybe a little after the fact. Okay, we all know about Eli Lilly. You mentioned one or two others. If you could share with our audience that often are very, very sharp investors, maybe one or two others that are not the big name, a little more off the grid of companies, public companies that are part or you're looking at in your ETF where our families could understand the nuances and do their own diligence.
So first of all, I would absolutely echo exactly what you said. Everyone listening in should be focused on their own risk tolerances and their own returns, and none of this is really a recommendation. What I would say is I'm probably going to keep my heart close to my chest, partly because we're talking here about investing in biotechnology, life sciences, healthcare. These areas have a lot of risks involved.
They're very volatile. Yes,
exactly. And I just think it's not prudent to recommend a single company, because we run a portfolio, and there's a reason why we run a portfolio. Not everything is going to work in this portfolio. It's a combination of companies, and there are offsets in the portfolio that you may not be aware of if you're looking for a single company. So what I would say is, for those interested, you can always head to the Tema ETF webpage and you look up the Tema GLP-1 Obesity and Cardiometabolic Fund. The ticker is HRTS, and you can see all of our holdings. They're published daily, and you can see all of the ideas that we've got in the fund. But my recommendation would be, obviously it's to buy the fund, but it's if it fits within your criteria. But it's a portfolio approach, and it's important that you're aware of that when you're looking at some of these holdings. There are lots of exciting companies in that portfolio.
Of course. And again, for those of you that do a little bit of the work, it is out there to take a look at in terms of what they're looking, or what they're actually more than looking, what they're invested in. So our special guest today was Yuri, Y-U-R-I, and I'm going to spell Yuri's last name, Khodjamirian. Khodjamirian. He's a CFA and Chief Investment Officer for Tema ETFs. You kind of already gave it, but I'm going to allow you to say it again, Yuri. For those that would like to explore more and learn more, what website could they go to, or how could they learn more so they can make their, again, think for themselves and make their own decision?
Absolutely. So you can head to our website, which is www.tema.etfs.com. And there you can actually find information about all of our funds, including the HRTS fund that we talked about today. If you click on the insights page, there's lots of articles and presentations and things like that that we've written and put together, especially about the cardiometabolic fund. Things like why we think active is important in this space, what the next 10 weight loss drugs look like, and other types of analysis that we've done. If you hit to the fund page, you can get interviews with our fund manager, but also lots of information about the fund itself, where you can buy and all of those things. So again, it's www.temaetfs.com.
Great. Thank you so much, Yuri. And everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. Welcome at Family Office. I hope you had a chance to enjoy it. You can learn more about me and my organizations. Very simply, my URL is my name. So it's angelorobles.com. For direct families and family offices, highly recommending you look into membership, which is all up at angelorobles.com. My membership group is called SFO Continuity. It is primarily focused on ultra high net worth investors in single family offices. There's lots of proprietary content written, private digital masterclasses, and about 30 plus intimate in-person programs that I host around the world, mainly US, but I occasionally will make a trip to another country and host a variety of gatherings, including maybe a cigar bar gathering, not to bring the health of everyone down with my habit of smoking cigars, but yes, I have done soirees and programs at cigar bars, I guess as they're called, before. So I hope you all had a chance to enjoy it. Being an investor and an allocator, this is obviously a fast-growing field. I personally am curious. I wanted to learn more. Am I knowledgeable about this specific subject? Well, from the GLP-1 perspective, not really. That's why having a great guest on so I could learn more is valuable. Just because I may be active personally and to some degree investing in health and wellness doesn't mean that I'm understanding the nuances of the things that I want to learn more about. And as new information comes in, I think all of us should learn that our opinions should adapt and change. Be very careful about being anchored. How much we're all connected, the technologies, the AI and all that, if you're really that slow to adapt and change to new information, it's going to be very, very hard to be successful. Everything is changing. You could argue some for the good, some for the bad. You have to make that decision yourself. But go to angelorobles.com and learn more about the work that I do. Highly recommend going to the website that Yuri recommended. Again, think for yourself, research, learn, make your own decision. But I think it's pretty obvious that there's major issues in obesity, heart disease, and a lot of the problems that present itself with being obese. And this is going to be a solution that many people, arguably at one time, maybe billion plus at some point in the future, may be taking. We just don't know. This is going to be very dynamic for pharmaceutical, biotech, medical device companies, medical device, not metal device. And I hope you all have a chance to do your own diligence and learn more. Enjoy. Yuri, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure.